Having been commissioned by the Revue de Questions Historiques some years ago to write a review of the correspondence of the Comte de Mercy with Maria Teresa, which had then just appeared, I made the following statement. The exact historical truth is to be found in these reports of mercy, and is a mean between the mass of partisan assertions of Madame Campan, Weber, and Montjoy on the one hand, and the calumnies and coarse insinuations of Besenval, Lauzun, and Soulavie on the other, between the systematic aspersion of her enemies and the almost superstitious enthusiasm of her friends, somewhere between the libel and the legend, but on the whole nearer the legend. Marie Antoinette was not a sinner, neither was she a saint. She was a pure and charming woman, somewhat heedless and frivolous, but always chaste. A queen somewhat too hot-headed in the patronage she bestowed, and inconsiderate in her political actions, but proud and energetic, a true queen, by reason of the dignity of her bearing and the splendor of her majesty. A true woman in virtue of the seductiveness of her manners and the tenderness of her heart, till she became a martyr, through the extremity of her trials and her triumphant death. 15 years of conscientious research, the examination of new and important documents, such as the papers of Count Fersen, the correspondence of Baron de Stael, that of Count von Goltz, that of Mercy with Joseph II, and Kaunitz, the memoirs of the Duchesse de Tourcelle, etc., have not changed my opinion, and I repeat now what I wrote in 1874. The same qualities that mark the first 10 years of Marie Antoinette's life in France are to be found during the last 13, until the fatal 16th of October, 1793, with only such changes as age, experience, maternity, and above all misfortune were bound to bring. I have sought to present them as they appeared to me after much study and comparison of texts, bearing in mind as far as possible not only the first, but the secondary causes that produced them. I have not suppressed either mistakes or faults, having no other desire but to discover the truth, and no other ambition but to speak it. Have I succeeded? It is for my readers to decide. If ever a nation were justified in being astonished by an event, it was by the alliance between the king and the Empress Queen, concluded in 1756. It was in these words that the Duc de Choiseul, Minister of Foreign Affairs, summed up this important event in his instructions to Comte de Choiseul in 1759, who had been appointed ambassador to Vienna, after having been one of the chief promoters of the change brought about in the policy of France during the 18th century, and so profound was his conviction that he repeated the same opinion again twice in the same terms. Once in 1761 to the Comte de Châtelet, and in 1766 to the Marquis de Dufort. The change was indeed a radical one, and public astonishment must have been great. For more than 2 centuries, France had been accustomed to regard Austria as her perpetual enemy, freed from anxiety on the score of England, who had been her hereditary foe during the whole of the Middle Ages, but who had been definitely driven across the Channel by the glorious career of Jeanne d'Arc, and later by the capture of Calais by François de Guise. She had been obliged from the beginning of modern times to fight not only for her power, but for her very existence, against the double menace of the Habsburgs, who in their 2 branches, the Spanish and Austrian, threatened her on the north, south, and east. To break this belt which was strangling us, to push back to the natural frontiers the advance posts which the King of Spain on the one side and the Emperor on the other had gained on our territory, to reconquer our liberty of movement and to assure to the crown of France the superior role which belonged to it by right of its antiquity, dignity, and grandeur. Such was the object pursued with patient obstinacy and patriotic cunning by all the princes since Francis I, and the great ministers who had served them, for a time eclipsed rather than given up. During the religious disputes under the last of the Valois, the struggle broke out again with renewed energy under the Bourbons. This struggle for existence was the cause of various alliances which must have been repugnant to his most Christian majesty, but which necessity imposed upon him. The alliances with the Sultan and with the Protestants of Germany and Holland, who, being hostile to Spain and Austria, were naturally useful allies for us, and it was thus under the protection of France that the grandeur of the Hohenzollern, who, from electors of Brandenburg, became kings of Prussia, was founded and developed. But the situation was changed. The conquest of Richelieu and Mazarin assured by the treaties of Westphalia, and of the Pyrenees, the victories of Louis the 14th, and even his defeats, which resulted in the Peace of Utrecht, has transformed the map of Europe. The House of Austria was forever expelled from Spain, where it had been replaced by the Bourbons. And if it continued to be a danger to us because of its possessions in Italy, and above all because of its domain in the Low Countries, where the coalition had obviously placed it as an advance guard against us, and because of its alliance with England, who, though kindly disposed toward Louis XIV under the Stuarts, had, with the accession of George III and the House of Hanover, resumed all anti-French traditions, the treaties of Vienna and of Aix-la-Chapelle, evicting it from Naples and Parma, and the Treaty of Belgrade, reducing it on the east, had essentially weakened its prestige while increasing that of Prussia. Was it wise to push our revenge further, to pursue to extinction our old adversary, already sufficiently humiliated, in order to raise on the ruins a young, restless, and warlike power, whose leader, governed by his ambitions and held in check only by his interests, had from the start shown himself a fractious and disloyal ally? Was it necessary, out of pretended respect for traditional policy, but in reality for mere routine, to persist in a system whose good effects had already been enjoyed? Or would it not be better, by ending a struggle, which for the future would be without object, to guarantee the results already acquired, and assure the equilibrium obtained? For some time, observant persons might have noted a decrease in the feud between the houses of France and Austria. The Emperor Charles VI, cured of his ideas of conquest and enlightened by his last defeats, had been contemplating a reconciliation with France, and Cardinal Fleury was by no means disposed to reject his overtures. He thought, as someone has justly remarked, that France and Austria, having both reached their full development, it would be wiser to seek to assure their power than to extend it, and that by uniting, they could exercise a pacific influence over the rest of Europe. The endorsement by Versailles of the pragmatic sanction, which assured the success of the Habsburgs, seemed the consecration of this policy of peace, and even the Treaty of Belgrade, wherein French influence exerted for the benefit of Turkey, checkmated the projects of the emperor, did not alter the aspect of affairs. An active correspondence was established between Charles VI and Fleury. And if we may believe the testimony of an unprejudiced witness, Frederick II. An unprejudiced witness. Frederick II. These intimate relations were on the point of resulting in the peaceful surrender of the Grand Duchy of Luxembourg to the king. It is asserted that before dying, the emperor recommended his daughter to ally herself with France. As for Louis XVI, his natural keen intelligence often comprehended the part it would be wise for him to play. Through his lack his lack of energy often made him fail to undertake it, and in this instance he shared the views of his minister and leaned visibly toward an understanding with the court of Vienna. We read in the instructions given to the Comte d'Estrées that the king had for a long time chafed at the prejudices against the establishment of a policy which would satisfy his heart, and which seemed to him more fitting than another for the maintenance of the only true religion, and the general peace, and for the curbing of the ambition of each prince within the limit and power of his particular estate. The unfortunate war of the Austrian succession, in which the cabinet of Versailles, urged by Frederick the Second, incited by the military faction and its chief, the Maréchal de Belle-Isle, and encouraged by public opinion, which was still imbued with the old prejudices, broke its promises. This war, which seemed to add but another to Austria's grievances against France, did not, however, put an end to her desire for a reconciliation. It seemed, on the contrary, to increase it by all the passion of revenge which Maria Theresa felt for the King of Prussia. The loss of Silesia, brutally seized without any declaration of hostility, seemed much more bitter to her than the surrender of Parma and Plaisance. Even during the war itself, she had on various occasions, and either directly or through the intervention of the court of Dresden, made overtures of peace to France, in particular even offering to cede certain places in the Low Countries, provided that the king would only remain neutral between her and the King of Prussia. After the peace of Aix-la-Chapelle, the overtures were continued, and we are bound to say were reciprocated. While the Count von Kaunitz, who was ambassador to Paris from 1751 to 1753 before he became the director of the Austrian policy, which position he held for more than 40 years, was exerting himself to establish cordial relations with the cabinet of Versailles, and succeeded to a certain degree, the instructions given to the French minister sent to Vienna bore the impress of a like goodwill. The Minister of State for Foreign Affairs, Monsieur de Puisieux, wrote in 1750, "The Marquis de Hautefort will be careful in his conversations with the imperial ministers, when the fitting occasion arises, to say that the king is by no means affected by the ancient prejudices which since the time of Charles V have made the House of France regard the House of Austria as her dangerous and implacable rival. That the hostility between these two great powers should no longer be a reason of state, and that His Majesty, on the contrary, is convinced that they would find their safety and mutual convenience in a sincere alliance and a perfect understanding which might be cemented between the two kingdoms." That this understanding, once established, would prevent future wars, which by exhausting the treasuries of the sovereigns are always so unfortunate for the nation. That this understanding, once established, would prevent future war. Which, by exhausting the treasuries of the sovereigns, are always so unfortunate for the nations who are their victims. That the engagements with the king, which the king would enter into with the court of Vienna, having no other end or motive but the public peace, would in no wise be incompatible with those which the two courts had already entered upon with other powers. The same language was used 3 years later to the Marquis d'Aubeterre. The same language. The same language. The same language. Language was used 3 years later to the Marquis d'Aubeterre, who succeeded the Marquis d'Aubeterre. There is no question today of the famous quarrels of Francis I and Charles V. Circumstances have changed. The king's only desire is to live. In harmony with the Empress Queen. No trace of those antiquated grievances remains in His Majesty's heart. In His Majesty's heart. He is wholly disposed. To contribute to the advantages of their imperial majesties. In any case, this idea of a reconciliation with Austria, as the instructions to Monsieur d'Hautefort proved, did not go as far as the breaking of other alliances. The King of France remained what he had been since the Treaty of Westphalia, the protector of the German Confederation. Though the friend of Austria, he had no intention of sacrificing Prussia to her. Prussia was a power which had sprung up under his patronage. He would not abandon it. But finding that the young power was well grown, that it was becoming restless, factious, discontented, and inclined to brave its tutor, and if need were, supplant him, he thought it time to check a development which, under the young successor of Frederick William, might become threatening. It was futile for France to regard Germany as a devoted ally, and it was foolish to raise up there a new rival. If it were not the honor or glory of France to deliver over the King of Prussia to the wrath of the court of Vienna, neither could she allow the Elector of Brandenburg to usurp the position occupied in Europe by the King of France. Things were at this pass, the two governments being obviously ahead. Public opinion. In their respective countries, and therefore limited to mere coquetry. Coquetry and civility when, in the beginning of September 1755, the Count von Staremberg, Austrian ambassador in Paris, asked for an interview with Madame de Pompadour in order to acquaint her with certain secret propositions with which the Empress had charged him. It is said that Maria Theresa, being desirous above all things that these negotiations should prove successful, and knowing the preponderating influence of the favorite, had not hesitated to write her a letter wherein she had carried her condescension to the point of addressing her as "dear friend." This is but tradition, and Maria Theresa herself took pains to deny it in a letter to the wife of the Elector of Saxony. But what the Empress had not done, the ambassador did not hesitate to do, and it was through the intervention of Madame de Pompadour that he presented the propositions. He had asked that the king appoint one of his ministers to be present at this first conference, who should afterwards serve as intermediary. The king named the Abbé de Bernis Abbé de Bernis, and although the favorite declared that this choice was spontaneous, it is difficult to believe that she did not at least suggest the name of this man, who was not a member of the council, but who, she knew, was wholly devoted to her. This appointment also served to conceal from the ministers, whose prejudices against Austria were well known, a proposition which appealed to the secret desire of the king. After some objections, Bernis accepted the mission confided to him, and his interviews with the Austrian ambassador began. On the following day, they took place in a little house situated below the terrace of Bellevue. the name of which, Babiol, served as a subject of pleasantry to the friends of Frederick II. Madame de Pompadour was present at the first. The others took place between Bernis and Staremberg alone. There was not even a secretary to do the writing. The intention of the Empress was to negotiate, as it were, tete-a-tete with the king. Maria Theresa, Joseph II, and Kaunitz at Vienna and at Versailles, the king and Madame de Pompadour were alone in the secret. It was not until after nearly 3 months that the French ministers, or at least some of them, were initiated. As to the foreign ministers, the secret was so well guarded, writes Bernis, that during more than 6 months they did not even suspect the understanding existing between us. Every evening Bernis submitted to the king the results of the day and had him approve all the answers and memoirs which he transmitted to Staremberg. Despite his sovereign's passionate desire to reach a conclusion, the French negotiator proceeded with the greatest precaution. He was always afraid of a snare. The very frankness and abandon with which the imperial government set forth its projects and disclosed its views put him on guard against their sincerity. The propositions of Maria Theresa offered real advantages for France, the House of Bourbon, and the peace of Europe, but they necessitated such a radical change of policy that Bernis hesitated to agree to them. The king would have accepted them more quickly, but he respected the motives of his plenipotentiary and left him free to act. The response to the first overtures of Staremberg was reserved, almost cold. They entrenched themselves behind the stipulations of Aix-la-Chapelle, and the negotiations were dragging along when an unexpected discovery came to change the face of things and hasten the conclusion. On the first day, and it was one of the chief facts on which he based his argument, the ambassador had averred that since the month of August the King of Prussia had been negotiating a treaty with England by means of the intervention of the Duke of Brunswick. But how could one believe in this defection? Our diplomats knew nothing of it. Was not this a trap which was baited by the excitement of our legitimate anger? The King of The King of Prussia had been bound to us for 14 years by a treaty which had still some months to run. How could one suppose that at the moment of renewing it, for nothing had shown any inclination on his part to break it, he would ally himself with England, at that time the faithful friend of Austria and our traditional enemy, particularly at that moment when a fresh conflict had just broken out between the two ancient rivals? On the 8th of June, 1755, in fact, in the midst of peace, and without any declaration of hostility, the English fleet had seized 2 French ships, the Alcide and the Lee. The insult had been keenly resented in France, and the Prussian minister in Paris, the Baron von Kneipphausen, outdoing the French in his indignation, went about repeating that such an aggression was intolerable, and that it should be punished without delay by attacking both England and her ally Austria, even offering the assistance of his master, who was ready to enter Bohemia with 40,000 men. The cabinet, not being ready, resisted these instigations, and contented itself with sending a remonstrance to the cabinet of London, abstained from all reprisals, but nonetheless continued its preparation for war, which every day seemed more inevitable. How could one believe that Frederick would choose precisely this moment to abandon his faithful ally? How could one believe that Frederick would choose precisely this moment to abandon his faithful ally? How could one believe that Frederick would choose precisely this moment to abandon his faithful ally who had just been brutally insulted and draw near to the aggressor against whom he was manifesting his disapproval so noisily. However strange and improbable Staremberg's revelation seemed, it was necessary to investigate it. An ambassador extraordinary, the Duke de Nivernais was sent to Berlin under a pretext of examining with the King of Prussia the manner of renewing the Treaty of 1741, in reality to discover his true sentiments and in a way to feel his pulse in this serious juncture. Grand Seigneur, in every sense of the term, but liberal. A man of the world and of the best society, with an open and enlightened mind, a poet at times, and a member of the French Academy, a partisan of Prussia, like most of the courtiers of that period. The Duc de Nivernais could not but be persona grata at Berlin. The king received him well, welcomed him both as plenipotentiary and as academician, heard his views, listened to his propositions, overwhelmed him with civilities, protested his attachment to France, strengthened his confidence, hoodwinked his perspicacity, and one fine day announced to him cynically that his minister to London had just signed a treaty of alliance with England. Despite the efforts which the Duke had made to persuade him not to ratify an act which at that moment was a veritable betrayal of us, he confirmed it in a way under his eyes on February 16, 1756, offering as compensation to sign one with us, which, as Bernie remarked, seemed like derision, and to all the remonstrances of the plenipotentiary he only replied by pleasantry. "You are very angry," he said, laughing. "Why don't you make a treaty with the Empress? I should not mind." During this time, the conferences of Bellevue, embarrassed by the first reply of Bernie, progressed but slowly. There was no question, moreover, of anything between France and Austria, but a simple guarantee treaty in which the French negotiator insisted upon having the Prussian king included. The news of Frederick's treachery precipitated matters. France could not remain without alliances and abandoned by Prussia. She was obliged to ally herself with the court of Vienna, or remain exposed to the League of the Great Powers of Europe. The negotiations, for a time interrupted by the illness of Bernice, resulted at last on May 1st, 1756, in an alliance defensive and neutral. This step gave rise to much controversy and severe criticism, both on its conclusion and later. The authors of memoirs who were devoted to the King of Prussia, the philosophers who were subsidized by him, the diplomats of the old school, whose ideas were thereby deranged, were not long in attacking this profound change in the policy of France. Frederick himself, in his writings, posed as a victim. History, better understood, has shown the true value of the recriminations of this strange champion of liberty and the rights of man. It has been clearly proved that it was he who first betrayed the alliance with France, and that the Treaty of Versailles was but a perfectly legitimate response to the Treaty of London. As for the consequences of this act, if they have not always been such as were prophesied and hoped for, if they have sometimes turned to the detriment of France and to the advantage of Austria, if they resulted in the disasters of the 7 Years' War and the partition of Poland, it was not the fault of the negotiators of the Treaty of 1756. It was not the fault of the negotiators of the Treaty of 1756, but of those who continued their work and who did not know how to reap the natural and just fruit of it. As Bernie himself had rightly observed, the failure was due to our bad conduct, to the poor use we made of our forces, and to the intrigues which governed the choice of our leaders. But at the time when this treaty was concluded, it solved in the most satisfactory way a difficult and delicate situation. When a new war broke out with England, it deprived her of her most powerful auxiliary. It sustained the Treaty of Westphalia, the foundation of our influence in Germany. It did not drag us into the differences between Austria and Prussia, since out of consideration for his former protégé, Louis the XV had expressly stipulated that no steps should be taken against the King of Prussia unless he violated the conditions of La Chapelle, in thus destroying or at least greatly diminishing the chances of a continental war, in securing our frontier to the north, and in uniting the two great powers. It gave us an opportunity to reconstruct our naval forces and to give ourselves up entirely to the maritime struggle with our ancient rival. It even enabled us to establish peace more promptly and on a better foundation. And thus Bernice writes, the king ought to have played the most important political and military role in Europe without infringing upon right or justice, in the place of the doubtful friendship of the King of Prussia, a factious and distrustful ally, strong indeed in the resources of his genius, but always ready to change sides in the interest of his ambition. We substituted an alliance with a power of the first order, which, having resigned its pretensions to universal dominion, its pretensions to universal dominion. And retired within its proper limits, was no longer a danger, but a support. It was an act of wisdom, and under the circumstances, an act of necessity. To speak truly, it was less the abandonment of the policy of Richelieu and of Louis XIV and its fulfillment and consecration, the greatest homage to Louis XV, the greatest homage which Louis XV could pay his predecessors and eminent statesman has written, was to recognize, as history should do today, that since they had pushed the claims of France against Austria to the uttermost, it was neither necessary nor prudent to push them further. And as if to cement this new policy, while the negotiations were pending in France, which resulted in the Treaty of Versailles, the Empress in Austria gave birth to the child who was one day to become the dearest bond of union and the living symbol of the alliance between the two countries.